My brother-in-law, who is married to my sister, told my wife that he was in love with her. This unexpected confession led to a chain of terrible events. Yesterday, out of the blue, my brother-in-law asked my wife if she could meet him for lunch. He said there was something he needed to talk to her about. When my wife told me about his invitation, she seemed confused, but not overly concerned. "It's about my sister," she asked, frowning. Her brow furrowed. "Maybe they're having problems. And he wants to get a woman's perspective on things." I found the whole situation odd. My brother-in-law had never reached out to my wife like this before. Although he often texted her and other family members for mundane reasons, I didn't think much of it. After all, we were a close-knit family, and it wasn't unusual for us to support each other through hard times. Shrugging off my initial discomfort, my wife agreed to meet him. We decided to meet at a cafe near her office the next day. The next morning, as she was getting ready for work, she mentioned lunch again. "Still not sure what this is about," she said, with a hint of worry in her voice. I reassured her that it was probably nothing serious. "Just listen to what he has to say, and if it's something we need to help with, we'll figure it out together." It was a busy cafe, filled with the usual lunchtime crowd. My wife felt a little more comfortable being in such a public setting, so she arrived a little early and found a table near the window where she could keep an eye on the entrance. He arrived a few minutes later, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. They exchanged the usual pleasantries and talked about work and the kids for a few minutes. But when their food arrived, he took a deep breath and dived into what he really wanted to say. At first, she thought he was just being polite when he started complimenting her, telling her how beautiful she looked. But then he went on to say how she had always been the light in his life, how she made him feel things he'd never felt before. "It was love at first sight," he said. "I've loved you since the first moment I saw you. If you were mine, I would treat you like the queen you are. I'd give you everything you deserve." My wife was stunned. She stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. This man, my brother-in-law, was married to my sister and the father of their 2 children. He poured his heart out to her, making big promises about how different life would be if they were together. He went on to say how he'd been harboring these feelings for years, how he'd watched and admired her from afar, and how he was more and more convinced that they were meant to be together. She tried to stop him and tell him he was making a huge mistake, but he kept talking over her, almost as if he'd rehearsed this speech 1,000 times in his head. This man had always had a friendly relationship with my wife and our family. We saw each other often because we were a close-knit family. He'd always been the fun uncle to our kids, the guy who was at every family barbecue and every holiday dinner. He texted my wife frequently, but it was always about mundane things like the kids' schedules and family events. There was nothing overly sexual, nothing that would set off any alarms. In fact, he also texted and called my mom, and they had a friendly relationship too. Neither of us had ever thought anything of it. He'd always just been a good guy to us, someone we trusted implicitly. When my wife told me this, it was like a punch in the gut. My wife didn't let him finish. Finally, she got up, scraped her chair on the floor, and walked out. She was shaking as she called me and told me everything that had just happened. While she was on the phone with me, his texts started coming in. They were apologies. He said he didn't mean it, that he thought it was just infatuation, and that he was sorry for making her feel uncomfortable. But the damage was done. She left work early to come home and talk to me about it. Her phone buzzed incessantly with his calls and messages. I told her to take one of his calls and put him on speaker phone so I could hear him. He was crying, begging her not to tell my sister. He kept saying it was a mistake, that he had misread signals and thought she was feeling the same way. Apparently, he thought my wife had been flirting with him last weekend when they'd had a moment alone in our kitchen where he'd felt a connection. My wife is a friendly person, and I suppose I can see how that could be construed as flirting, but this was beyond anything we could have imagined. I could imagine him asking if she told me, and I answered yes since I was on speaker phone. Then he started begging us to keep this a secret. This went on for an hour. While he begged and we listened, my main question was whether he had cheated on my sister before. He swore on the lives of his children that he hadn't, that it was just my wife. At that point, I was done listening. I told him that I wasn't going to do anything that night and that I would call him tomorrow. Now we were left with this mess, not knowing what to do. The next thing my wife said was that we should go over to my sister's house right now and tell her. But the idea of destroying my sister's family killed me. Thinking about what this would do to my nieces made me want to throw up. I know the right thing to do is to tell my sister, but I'm also thinking about my wife. It's not her fault, but I'm sure there will be resentment from my family, even if my sister doesn't divorce him and they reconcile. If they reconcile, I don't see how we'll ever be together like we were before. I don't give a damn about him. He tried to destroy my family, but I do care about everyone else. Another update, I couldn't wait to tell you last night. My sister was right. I got a call from my sister. She sounded upset and said she had to tell me something. Something that made my heart sink as she explained that her husband, my brother-in-law, had come to her in tears and claimed that my wife had tried to start an affair with him. He'd spun a tale where my wife was the instigator, trying to shift the blame entirely onto her. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I immediately told my sister that this was not the case and assured her that I would take care of this situation. I said this needed to be addressed face to face, not over the phone. I hung up the phone and, with a sense of urgency, called my parents. I woke my mother and father and explained what had happened in short, clipped sentences. My father was furious, my mother sounded shocked but determined. They agreed to go over to my sister's house to sit with her children and offer the support she desperately needed. Next, I called my younger brother. He groggily answered, and his confusion turned to alarm as I filled him in. He promised to come over to our house and stay with our children to make sure they weren't left alone in this turmoil. His calm presence would be a comfort to them. Meanwhile, my wife was already gathering her things. Her face was pale and drawn. She dreaded the confrontation but knew it was necessary. We left the house in a hurry. The drive to my sister's house felt longer than it actually was. In fact, the silence in the car was heavy. Both of us were lost in our thoughts. When we arrived, the scene was even more tense than I had imagined. My sister was on the porch with my brother-in-law. When we got there, he looked beaten. His eyes were downcast, and his posture was slumped in defeat. He knew we had the texts and voicemails, the undeniable proof of his actions. I really don't know what he was hoping to accomplish by calling my sister in the middle of the night with his lies. Maybe he thought he could get ahead of the story, twist the narrative to save himself, but it was a futile effort. As we approached them, the tension in the air was palpable. My wife was trembling, her face a mask of controlled anger and pain. She handed my sister her phone without a word. My sister took it, her hand steady, but her eyes burned with a mixture of anger and pain. She scrolled through the texts, her expression hardening with each one she read. Then she listened to the voicemails, the damning evidence of his explanations and her denials. Before she could say something, my brother-in-law began sobbing. This was a man who ran into burning buildings, who faced danger every day without flinching. To see him like this, broken and vulnerable, his cries deep and guttural, raw with emotion, was a scene that was almost surreal. A big, tough firefighter brought to his knees by his own actions. My sister's face remained impassive, a mask of stern determination. She'd always been tough, but right now she was unyielding. She waited for him to finish. Her silence was more powerful than any words. When he finally calmed down, still hiccuping with the remnants of his sobs, she spoke. "Pack a bag and go," she said, her voice cold and hard. "I can't bear to look at you." He tried to argue, to plead his case, but she was having none of it. She snapped, cutting through his words. "There is nothing you can say that will make this better." She turned away from him, walked over to my wife, and pulled her into a hug. It was a moment of solidarity between them, a small comfort in the midst of this nightmare. They'd been friends since college, and the strength of their bond was a relief to see. Despite everything, they stood together. That left me with my brother-in-law. He was a wreck, his face red and swollen from crying. He looked down at me, his eyes pleading for some kind of understanding or forgiveness, but I had none to offer. He tried to speak, his voice cracking, but I cut him off. "You have to leave," I said firmly. This is your mess, you need to deal with the consequences. He nodded, defeated, and slowly made his way inside to pack his things. My sister stayed with my wife, the two of them talking quietly, leaning on each other for support. The rest of the night was a blur of conversations and plans. We were trying to rally around my sister and help her figure out what to do next, how to protect her children from the fallout. My sister began to question my wife, trying to understand why her husband thought any of this could possibly work. She insisted that there were no problems in their marriage, that everything had been fine. My wife was crying at this point, tears streaming down her face as she tried to make sense of the situation. "There's nothing you haven't seen," she said, her voice shaking. She handed the phone back to my sister, and together they painstakingly went through every text sent over the past 2 years. They read each one carefully, looking for any hint of inappropriate behavior, but there was nothing there. My wife was just being herself. She has a playful personality, always joking and teasing. It's part of what makes her so lovable and approachable. My brother-in-law has a similar sense of humor, and they've always teased each other in a light-hearted, harmless way. She does the same with my mother and my younger brother. It's just the way she interacts with people. The only incident my wife can think of that might have been misinterpreted happened this past weekend. She recounts it and tries to pinpoint where things went wrong. They were all together at our house, and she and my brother-in-law both reached for the refrigerator at the same time. They were playfully jostling to see who would get there first, laughing as they did so. He let her win, but then he reached around her waist to grab a beer, moving his hands slowly. She admits that in that moment, the way he did it, it felt a little inappropriate. It was a fleeting feeling, and she brushed it off, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. As a result, she now wonders if her silence gave him false hope. My sister listened, her expression softening. She did not blame my wife for any of this. She knows her well enough to understand that her playfulness is not an invitation for more. It's not her fault. She reassured my wife, who nodded, though the guilt still lingered. They finished reading the messages. It was clear there was never any mutual attraction, no hidden signals or secret flirtations. My wife was just being herself, and my brother-in-law took that and twisted it into something it wasn't. The realization that this misunderstanding has caused so much pain is almost too much to bear, but at least my sister's faith in my wife remains intact. So then my sister starts going through his MacBook to see what else she doesn't know about. She's angry and desperate at this point, her hands shaking as she types. She guesses the password, and on the third try, she's in. Taking a deep breath, she begins to search through his files, looking for anything that might shed more light on this nightmare. It doesn't take long. She finds something disturbing. Buried in a folder with an innocuous label, there are a lot of pictures of my wife. They go back years, and what's more disturbing is that they're always just her, never in group settings or candid family moments. My sister clicks through them, her anger turning into a cold, creeping horror. One set of photos stands out from a couple of years ago. We went on a couple's vacation to the beach. It was a rare vacation without the kids, and my wife felt more relaxed in the adults-only environment. She was wearing a bikini, which she doesn't usually do. She usually prefers more modest swimwear, but this time she felt comfortable enough to do so. There were probably 50 pictures of her in that bikini, taken without her knowledge. My sister's face paled as she scrolled through them. Clearly, he's been secretly taking these photos for years, collecting them. Obsessively, the realization that he has harbored this fixation, lurking in the shadows of family events, sends a shiver down her spine. Are we entering restraining order territory? She wonders aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. This has taken a creepy turn far beyond what any of us could have imagined. The line between inappropriate and downright disturbing has been crossed, and she calls us over to show us the pictures. My wife gasps, and her hand flies to her mouth. In shock, she had no idea what he was doing, no inkling of his obsession. My sister, her anger now tempered by a deep sense of betrayal, begins to discuss next steps, legal action, protection for her children, and a restraining order. All options need to be considered. Now, we're all reeling from this new discovery. The man we thought we knew, trusted as a husband, father, and brother-in-law, has revealed a dark and disturbing side of himself. This is no longer a matter of mere infatuation, it's something much more insidious. Unfortunately, the chaos continues. My sister has agreed to talk to her husband and let him explain himself. She was determined to get the whole story and decided to involve my wife directly to ensure there would be no lies or half-truths. They set up a FaceTime call with my wife, and I listened off camera, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and fear. My sister thoroughly recorded the entire conversation for good measure as soon as the call began. The tension was palpable. My brother-in-law looked exhausted, his eyes red, ringed and puffy from crying. He was hesitant, his voice shaky, but as he spoke, the truth began to pour out, and the story unfolded in a way none of us had fully anticipated. He admitted that he had been obsessed with my wife for years. It started the day I met her, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. He went on to explain that it was during one of those early gatherings where my sister was eager to introduce her new boyfriend to her friends. My wife and I were dating at the time, but he had met her before he met me. At first, he thought his feelings were purely physical, an innocent crush that he could put aside. But as time went on and he spent more time with her, he realized it was more than that. He became fixated on her personality, her laughter, the way she interacted with everyone around her. He described moments when he found himself watching her, captivated by her presence, even when she was just being her playful and kind self. He described how he had tried to suppress these feelings, telling himself they were harmless. But as time passed, his obsession grew. He began to find ways to be around her more often, volunteering to help with family events, using excuses to text her about trivial things. It was a slow, insidious process that eventually led to the point where he felt compelled to confess his feelings, fooling himself into believing that she might feel the same way, despite his being married to my sister. Listening, my sister's face was a mask of controlled anger and heartbreak. She didn't interrupt him, letting him dig his own grave with every word. My wife, on the other hand, was visibly shaken when she heard how long this had been going on and how deep his obsession was. It was almost too much for her to bear. When he finished, there was a heavy silence. My sister finally spoke, her voice icy. "What made you think that my wife would leave me for you?" she asked, her eyes boring into his. He stammered, struggling to find the words. He mentioned the supposed mutual attraction, the moments he had misinterpreted as signs of her reciprocation. At this point, my wife and sister exploded. Their pent-up anger and frustration spilled over, and there was a lot of cursing and screaming. The raw emotion of betrayal and hurt filled the air. My wife hung up the phone, her hands shaking, her face pale. She was worried about me, about us. She repeatedly assured me that the attraction was one-sided. I believed her. I always had, even if she might have found him physically attractive at some point. I knew she would never act on it. She was serious about trust and fidelity, something she made clear early on in our relationship. This whole ordeal was a twisted fantasy of my brother-in-law, a dangerous delusion that had nearly torn our family apart. The tension that had built up during the call finally erupted into a storm of cursing and screaming. My wife's voice was a mixture of anger and pain, while my sister's was steely and unforgiving. The barrage of emotions was overwhelming, filled with betrayal and disbelief. The call ended abruptly as my wife, shaking and distraught, hung up. She turned to me, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "It was one-sided," she assured me, her voice trembling. "I never thought it was me," I replied, trying to reassure her. I remembered watching her dress one morning, admiring her without saying a word. She noticed me, gave me a teasing smile, and asked me if I liked what I saw. But then her expression became almost serious, her tone cold and leaving no room for misunderstanding. "You'll never see this again," she meant it, and my wife always means every word she says. Trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. As I sat there replaying the chaotic scene in my mind, I couldn't help but think about my brother-in-law. I knew he was a little cocky, always walking with a certain swagger. But, my God, I never knew he thought so highly of himself to think he could do something like this. His delusions of grandeur were completely staggering, detached from reality. Later, when the initial shock had worn off and we could talk more calmly, I spoke to my sister. She was determined to protect her children from the consequences of her husband's actions. She told me that she would be contacting a lawyer on Monday morning to see what steps she could take to limit his exposure to her children. She wanted to make sure they were shielded from as much of this mess as possible. As far as I'm concerned, he's out of touch with reality, she said, her voice steely and determined. Her concern was no longer about saving her marriage but about protecting her children and providing them with a sense of stability. Anyway, my brother-in-law returned home yesterday, not because my sister wants him back, but because she can't legally stop him. Despite the turmoil and clear betrayal, he has the right to be in the house until the legal situation is resolved. The atmosphere is tense and uncomfortable, filled with unspoken words and palpable resentment. They are finished, and I think he realizes that. There's a hollow look in his eyes, as if he understands that any hope he had of saving their marriage is gone. The lawyer tells my sister that, given my brother-in-law's behavior over the past few days, there is a good chance that she will be granted full custody of the children. The texts, voicemails, and the disturbing cache of photos all paint a clear picture of his obsession and instability. He doesn't even seem to want to fight her about it. It's like he knows he's lost everything and is too tired to put up a fight. My sister will be fine. She's stronger than she looks, and any love she had for him seems to have vanished. She moves through the house with a determined air, her focus now entirely on her children and their future. She doesn't seem broken by it, rather, she looks like someone who has faced the truth and is ready to move on. The kids don't know what happened, but they sense something. Kids always do, but they don't know the details. My brother-in-law was never around much anyway when the kids were home. He often slept at the firehouse, pulling double shifts. His absence was a constant in their lives, a silent but ever-present void to which they had grown accustomed. But it's going to be hard for them once they learn what's going to happen to the stability of their home and the presence of their parents, even if it's a broken family. My sister is prepared for the change. She's already talked to a child psychologist to help her deal with the inevitable questions and emotions that will arise. She's ready to be both mother and father, giving them the love and support they'll need. As for my brother-in-law, he remains in the guest room, a silent figure in a house that no longer feels like home. He seems resigned to his fate, going through the motions but without any real struggle. It's a sad, pitiful sight, but my sympathy is limited. Some of my friends have said that there must be more women like my wife that someone as obsessive as my brother-in-law could be fixated on. But as far as we can tell, there hasn't been anyone else. It's really just his unique and intense obsession with my wife, leaving no room for anyone else. Also, after everything came out, my wife blocked his phone number and tried to distance and protect herself from his unwanted advances. But the same night he came home, he sent my wife an email from an account he had just created. It started with what seemed like a sincere apology, but it quickly took a turn into something much darker. He began by saying that he was never finished at the restaurant that day, implying that there was more to confess than he had. Then he launched into paragraphs and paragraphs about all the things he loved about my wife, describing the despair he felt, the overwhelming emotions that had driven him to act so irrationally. He detailed every little detail that he admired about her, her smile, her laugh, the way she interacted with others. It was disturbing, to say the least, to see his obsession so starkly. He mentioned their supposed mutual attraction, insisting that there was a palpable sexual tension between them, delusionally mistaking her friendly and playful nature for something more. He painted a picture of a connection that existed only in his mind, a fantasy that he had convinced himself was real. The email ended with a rather large section about me. Let's just say I didn't know that he had such a low opinion of me, making sure to imply that I was not satisfactory. He even criticized my wife, everything from my appearance to my behavior, suggesting that I was somehow unworthy of her. He was clearly trying to undermine me, to sow seeds of doubt and insecurity. Reading the email was a gut punch. It was clear that his obsession with my wife had skewed his perceptions and fueled his contempt for me, seeing me as an obstacle, someone unworthy of the woman he had put on a pedestal. Instead of feeling threatened, it only strengthened my resolve to protect my wife and my family from his delusions. I forwarded the email to my sister and her lawyer. It was more evidence of his unstable mental state, another piece of the puzzle that showed just how far his obsession had gone. This email, with its mix of apology, obsession, and vitriol, might be enough to get him out of the house. For now, my wife and I are taking it one day at a time. The support of our friends and family has been invaluable in helping us get through this surreal and painful situation. My wife is not doing well, but she is getting better every day. She blames herself a bit for being too comfortable around my brother-in-law. She is usually very careful about setting boundaries with other men, and understandably so. My wife is quite stunning and receives a lot of male attention, but she felt safe around my brother-in-law because he was family, and she never thought he would cross any lines. Fortunately, she and my sister are on good terms, and there seem to be no hard feelings, which is a relief. We will all be fine, but it will take time. So, thank you to everyone who has commented and offered support. My main concern throughout this has been my sister and her children. The impact of my brother-in-law's actions on their lives is immense, and ensuring their safety and emotional well-being became our priority. Children especially need to be shielded from such toxic situations to maintain their sense of safety and normalcy. In such a situation, it is essential to act quickly and decisively. Don't hesitate to gather evidence, confront the problem, and seek legal counsel to ensure the safety and well-being of everyone involved. Procrastination or denial could have resulted in further harm. What do you think about this story? Please share your thoughts below, and thank you for listening to Vibe Tales.